It's gonna be alright.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Stoa. We've got an intimate crew starting off this Saturday morning for some, so welcome. Good to have you here. And today we're going to continue our series called The Entity Pill, where we're exploring the phenomenon of disincarnate entities with a transperspectival approach. And today we're very lucky to have Jerry Marzinsky joining us. Jerry is a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 35 years of experience working with and studying the thought processes of psychotic and criminally insane patients. And Jerry first noticed the contradictions between what he had been taught about schizophrenia by the ivory tower and what he has witnessed and learned from the schizophrenic patients themselves. So how today's going to work, Jerry and I will have a conversation maybe for the first half. And if you have any questions, pop it in the chat anytime. And then when we turn to the Q&A portion, you can ask Jerry a question. So yeah, that being said, Jerry, welcome to the Stoa. Oh, and you're on mute. Let's see. Yeah. Can you?
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
All right.
All right.
Okay. Where would you like me to start?
I was hoping for the people who are here today and watching who don't know who you are to kind of give a 101 Jerry Marzinsky. So I guess my first question would be, could you share your experience as a psychotherapist working with schizophrenic patients and maybe highlighting what your initial beliefs about schizophrenia were uh, based off your training?
Okay. Um, well, I spent probably close to 50 years on the front line of mental health. I've worked in virtually every mental health setting they have available in the U.S. I started off at the biggest psychiatric hospital on the planet. There were like 10,000 patients there when I got there. So for somebody who was interested in abnormal psychology, that was like a psychiatric candy store. Um, but one thing I noticed in going through college and graduate school, they had what looked like a scientific description of all of these mental illnesses, but they didn't have any cures. It was just descriptions, and it was like the DSM was their Bible, the dictionary of mental illnesses thing. Um, so I worked there. I worked probably for 17 or 18 years in the psychology department of a state prison. Um, I worked in mental health centers. I worked in several hospital ERs doing psychiatric crisis. I was a contractor for a while. Um, I have a private practice I've had for 3 years now, working with a new energetic therapy that actually cures psychological problems. It's not like just talking, over and over with the same thing and or taking drugs. I mean, it actually gets to the cause of psychological problems, and it actually gets rid of them. I mean, and it does it very quick. So it's an energetic psychotherapy that I think it's the cutting edge of where psychology and psychiatry have to go. You know, if you want results, it has to move in this direction, in an energetic direction. So when I first started at the big psychiatric hospital, nothing in school, nothing in college or graduate school prepared me for what I was going to experience there. Uh, and then the contradictions between what I was taught in graduate school and what I was actually seeing started popping up. Um, the first thing, uh, I saw was the voices. So it took me about a year to learn how to talk to schizophrenics about their voices because there's no positive benefit to them talking about them. They get banished. People get afraid of them. Their friends leave them. They're treated like weirdos. Um, their parents get upset or their relatives get upset. They ended up dragging them into a psychiatrist's office. The psychiatrist pronounces, "All right, you got schizophrenia. It's a lifelong thing. There's nothing you can do about it. It's hopeless. All you can do is take our toxic meds and come and visit us once a month and get your prescriptions." I mean, it's a very, very discouraging, very uh, depressing message for them to send. Um, so these drugs are awful. They did not like these drugs. Uh, they have awful, awful side effects. Um, so one thing I noticed that it was a massive state hospital. It's the size of a small city. The state of Georgia would send everybody there. Um, and I think there were 3,000 acres it owned, and there were over 200 buildings there when I got there. It's closed down now, and it's one of the most haunted places in Georgia now. Um, but I started noticing patterns when I started talking to these schizophrenics. There were patterns that started appearing. Now, there are no patterns with hallucinations. Hallucinations are all over the place. I mean, they're positive, they're negative, they're neutral, there's no predicting them. But these predictable patterns started showing up. And the first one that I saw was that these voices were consistently negative. They were always putting the person down, saying, "You're stupid, you're ugly, you're crazy, nobody likes you, we're watching you, we're going to kill you, um, the psychiatrist is poisoning you, uh, your parents are just faking like they like you, people are watching you, they're after." It was always negative. And if there was anything positive, it was only to get the person's attention so they could come around behind them later and get them. So the first question I asked is like, what is holding these voices on such a narrow path? I mean, some force was keeping them from being random like all other hallucinations. It was like, what force is holding them on a negative trajectory? Why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? So psychiatry, without having done any studies on the voices at all, it went, well, we're psychiatrists. It was like the reminded me of the friggin' ancient Egyptian priests. We're psychiatrists and we hereby pronounce that these voices are hallucinations because we said so, without any research whatsoever. Matter of fact, they never even questioned these patients about their voices. They just wrote them out as off as hallucinations, and that started, back in, what was it, the 50s, when the Rockefellers took over the medical system in the U.S. Um, they paid off Congress to pass laws that the only valid form of medicine in medical schools that could be taught were pharmacological medicine. Yeah. So it had to be based around giving drugs. So that knocked out naturopathy, it knocked out uh, acupuncture, it knocked out electric therapies, it knocked out naturopathy, it knocked out all these other emerging fields in medicine. Okay? And all those were called scams or derogatory names. So at that point, they took over the medical system, and then they started teaching this stuff in the universities. And they, when the antipsychotic drugs came out, I think they were discovered in Germany in a dye lab, and then the French took them and they purified whatever it was in the dye, and they tried to test this in Europe, and Europe was Freudian at the time. They didn't allow it. So they took these phenethylamine drugs and they brought them over to the U.S. and they started administering them on a psychiatric hospital. And they found that they could drug the entire population with these. They were major tranquilizers, and they would calm these people down, and they weren't causing as much trouble because before the drugs, they had to fight them and wrestle them into straitjackets, and then wrap them in those straitjackets until they just exhausted themselves fighting. So patients were getting hurt, staff was getting hurt. So at that time, there was a battle between neurology and psychiatry. They were neck and neck for who was going to kind of take over the, that segment. and psychiatry was badly losing. So they latched onto these drugs, and that was their salvation. So then they started spreading all over the US because they were cheaper than hiring more staff to control these people. People weren't getting hurt, but they had no idea why they worked. For the first 10 years, they had absolutely no idea why they worked. And they didn't get rid of the voices that these people were hearing. All they did was sedated them. The voices were still there. They weren't as strong, and they weren't as persistent. Okay, so they were basically drugging these entire populations to control them. Um, so they didn't know why that drug worked. So I think it was in the 70s when Prozac came out. Eli Lilly, the drug company, they didn't know why their antidepressants worked either. So they figured, okay, well, it has some soothing effect. So it must be something chemical. So they made up a complete lie and said, well, the body or the mind has a biochemical imbalance. And that's why these drugs work, because they're chemicals and they somehow balance whatever's going on. They knew it was a lie at the time, but they needed some excuse for why their drugs worked, and they didn't have any. So they started putting that out there, and they started teaching that in the universities, and it was a complete fabrication. It was a complete lie. They knew it at the time. So then they started teaching it in medical schools. So here's all these people, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, all coming out of higher education, believing that mental illness is caused by some chemical imbalance in the brain. So one of the first things I noticed when I went to work at the psychiatric hospital, I was working with teams of psychiatrists, and never, ever did I see them give any kind of test before they administer these drugs to find out what chemicals in the brain were out of balance or by how much. So I'm like, what's going on with there? They had no baseline. You know, what they were doing was just kind of getting a dartboard and throwing the dart at what they thought would work. So based on their experience with all these different drugs, they go, well, I think we'll start with this drug, and then they'd administer that. And if that didn't work, they'd either raise the level or lower the level, or they'd add more drugs, or they add different drugs, or they changed the drugs. But it was always this kaleidoscope of different drugs. Nobody was being cured. Everybody was being dumbed down. You know. And so one day I asked one of the psychiatrists, I said, well, if you're not giving any kind of tests, I've never seen you guys give any kind of objective test to find out what chemicals in the brain are out of balance or by how much. I said, how do you know what drugs to prescribe? And he said, oh, the drug companies tell us which ones to use for what. And I'm like, what? Well, like thinking, you got to be kidding. It's like letting the fox in the hen house. So there is no test for these imbalances. They don't exist. They never have. They don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be. And yet they're teaching this farce in the universities to all these students who are coming out believing that mental illness is due to a biochemical imbalance of the brain. So they started out blaming schizophrenia on mothers. Oh, the mothers did something to cause schizophrenia. And the mothers went, well, what did we do? What? Where's the pattern? What do we do? So that was observable. It didn't hold any water. So they had to kick it up somewhere where the average person could not see what was going on. So they kicked it up to genetics. They go, oh, it's a genetic disorder. And the geneticists went, hey, we're not finding anything. And then they went, oh, well, it's not just a single genetic schizophrenia gene. It's hundreds and hundreds of genes all mixed together, and then we know it's due to genes, and we just don't know which ones or how they work yet. So they passed it off as that. There was no verifying that. You had to be a geneticist, and a small number of geneticists might have been interested in schizophrenia, so they got away with that for a decade or more. And then finally, some geneticists said, hey, we don't see any genetic markers for mental illness. What are you talking about? And that blew them out of the water. So they had to come up with something else. So they came up with this biochemical imbalance garbage. And they got away with that for 15, 20 years. Well, it's a biochemical imbalance, and only our drugs can kind of set it right. So the biochemists came up and they went, hey, we don't see any biochemical imbalance. What are you talking about? You know, so they went nuts on that, and then but they're still teaching. And the drug companies are still advertising. Well, we believe it is a biochemical imbalance in the serotonin. No research into it at all. It's completely fabricated. So these people are duplistic from the start. I mean, money, money, money. That's all they were interested in. Money, money, money. They're making $17.4 billion a year selling these antipsychotic drugs worldwide now. Billion. I'm talking million, billion. And these drugs are toxic. They're toxic to the brain. What they found with long-term patients in state hospitals who've been taking these drugs for many years, that their brains were shrunken like walnuts. So those researchers started publishing that information saying, hey, look, it looks like these drugs are actually destroying the nervous system. They're destroying the brain. So the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went, oh no, it's the schizophrenia that's doing it. It's not our drugs. So the researchers went, well, okay, let's see. And they started feeding those drugs to rats and monkeys and mice and saw that their brains were shrinking too. Their peripheral nervous systems were destroyed. Uh, so they said, yeah, it is your drugs. But I have never, ever seen a psychiatrist tell any patient how dangerous those drugs were with long-term use, ever. They'd say, oh, well, your mouth will get dry. Your vision might get blurred for a while. You might feel sedated for a little while, maybe a little nervous, and that's it. But I watched what they were doing in the psychiatric hospital when those neuroleptic symptoms started appearing. The akinesia, the shaking, the tongue darting, the neurological symptoms of toxicity of the nervous system. They didn't cut those drugs off. They would administer cogentin to mask those symptoms. So here they are. They continued the destruction of the nervous system while masking it with cogentin. They're doing that in private practice also. So it's what they're doing is I don't know. It's just they've hoodwinked the entire planet. They've taken over the entire Western mental health system. You know, the entire West is doing these things. They're, in Russia, they're experimenting with fasting. They're finding long-term fasting. There's a 70% improvement rate with fasting. You think psychiatrists here are going to do anything? No, they're just dishing out drugs. You're not going to go into a psychiatrist's office and not come out with some diagnosis uh, and some prescription, right? So that was the first one that hit me. The they're lying. They're lying about a biochemical imbalance. Uh, and then these other patterns start appearing. And the more I questioned schizophrenics, the more these patterns showed up. But then one day a schizophrenic got upset, or his voices got upset about me asking him questions about the voices. He went to one of the psychiatrists in the unit and said, hey, this guy's upsetting me. He's asking me questions about the voices and it really pisses me off. So I ended up in the psychiatrist's office the next morning being ordered. You will not ask any more questions about their voices. What you're doing is reinforcing their hallucinations and you're making them worse. I'm thinking in the back of my head is you're full of crap. You have your head where the sun don't shine. I already knew enough at that point, but they're the ones that run the mental health systems. By the way, they have one of the highest suicide rates of any doctors out there. And they're running the mental health systems. So that happened twice where I was told by psychiatrists, do not ask them questions about the voices. You're just reinforcing their hallucinations. So I had to kind of keep a low profile at the state hospital and just kind of uh, lower my investigation and just be real careful I didn't set any of these guys off. I didn't stop asking questions, but it really was like driving with the brakes on. So a second pattern appeared is one day one of the schizophrenics that I was working with came in and said, the voices hate the 23rd Psalm. They absolutely hate it. He said they react to the 23rd Psalm like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. And I went, well, that's interesting. So I started asking all the schizophrenics that I had on my caseload, what happens when you read the Bible? What happens when you go to church? Uh, what happens when you read spiritual material? If you ever talk to a preacher, and what I noticed is when the preacher for the psychiatric rehab unit that I was working for would hold ice cream socials down in the big auditorium, none of the schizophrenics would go. And I noticed that the first time, and I went, well, that's odd. And then it happened the second time, so I started asking them questions about it. And it was like, oh no, there's no God. I prayed to God. It didn't help me. Um, this religion is a bunch of crap. You know, the voices don't like me reading the Bible. So I started an investigation into that. Uh, I would ask them, what happens when you go to church? And I would ask scores of them. Have you ever been to church? What did the voices do when you go to church? I found that if the voices were very weak and the person went to church, the voices would shut up. If they were of moderate strength, they would kick up, they'd start mocking the preacher, they'd get louder to blot out whatever the preacher was saying so the person couldn't hear it. So they had to struggle to hear what the preacher was saying. And if they were very strong, they would actually run them out of the church. They'd get up and run out of the church because it became so painful for them. So it became very clear. What I started doing was handing out the 23rd Psalm to schizophrenics that I was working with. And I said, when you hear the voices, repeat this and then come back and tell me what happened. There was always a negative reaction. So whatever these things were, they were anti-religious. So, you know, they, they ran patterns, which was atypical for a hallucination. They were consistently negative. They didn't like religion. What kind of hallucination would be anti-religious? So here's these patterns that kept building up that made no sense in view of what I was taught in graduate school. The third one that came up was that they were reporting that after the voices hit, they were totally drained of energy. They had no energy, and it was just um, they just accepted that. Like, they didn't think about it. It was just like, okay, the voices make me feel bad. I couldn't get any sleep, but that must be the reason. Um, but it was consistent. So I started asking them, how do you feel after the voices strike and leave? They say, well, I have no energy. One guy said I felt like I was digging ditches in the hot sun all day. That's how drained he was. They couldn't get up for breakfast. And this was consistent. There was a one-to-one correlation between the voices showing up and attacking them and their energy being gone. And they didn't even notice it. So I started asking them about it. I said, well, what happens when the voices come? What happens to your energy level? And they go, well, I don't, let me think about it. And they would say, well, my energy's gone. And I said, where do you think it went? You were just laying in bed all night, tossing and turning, and voices were screaming at you. You didn't do any physical work, did you? "Yeah, no. Well, then you didn't use that energy, did you? No. Then where do you think it went? Well, I don't know. Well, this happened time after time. Every time the voices come, your energy level just goes down to nothing. What do you think happened to it? Well, I don't know. Well, if you were to stick your hand in a fire 1,000 times and every time you got burned, what's burning you? They didn't have any trouble saying the fire. But I say, well, the voices have come probably thousands of times since they started with you. Every time they came, your energy level dropped to nothing. Where do you think your energy went? You know, a handful of them might say the voices took it. The others would say, well, I don't know. It's like they were being blocked from seeing that. And what I found out later was that if I told the patient that, the voices got very upset. They did not want them to know that they were parasites, that they were feeding off them. And this was especially true when I was working psych crisis. The last 10 years I was working for somebody else in the emergency rooms. In the emergency room, the doctors didn't know what to do with psychotic or or psychiatric patients. They just wanted them out of there so they could get to the medical people that they knew what to do with. So it was my job to find them somewhere else to go, to get them out of the emergency room, to either, release them admit them to the psychiatric units or send them back with their, but to get them out of there. So they weren't giving them any help at all. So I was thinking, what few pieces of information can I give the ones I can trust that would help them the most? And those two were, the voices aren't you. They don't come from you. They're not your mind, you know. And number two, that they're parasites. So when I went to tell them they're parasites, you've noticed, look at the pattern of your voice, of your energy disappearing. The voices got very upset. And in the emergency room, these people were raw. In the prison, they were on medications. They were already kind of calmed down. They were under control. The prison was designed to deal with violent behavior. The emergency room wasn't. So there wasn't ever a officer or guard posted in the emergency room. We always had to call one in if we needed backup. Uh, and there was one girl, I told them that, and she got up and she ran out of the office and then started running wild around the day room. So the voices didn't like them knowing that information. Um, so those were the three biggies I found while I was working in the state hospital. And the last one was um, one thing I noticed at the state hospital is that the psychiatrists were always being assaulted. They were being assaulted at a rate higher than anybody else. Yeah. And it was always, oh, hey, do you know that psychiatrist so and so got punched in the face by a patient on such and such a unit? And I'm like, well, they're only spending like 20 minutes a month with these psychiatric patients. And like, what are they saying to them in 20 minutes that are causing these people to, beat the crap out of them? It was a mystery to me. I just couldn't figure it. So the seventh year I was there, uh, I was working with schizophrenic patients, and we were training them in low level jobs. If they stayed on their meds, they'd be able to hold those jobs. So if they went off their meds 3 times, we would discharge them because they were making it clear they weren't going to stay on those meds. So there was one girl I had, she was doing very well in cosmetology class. She was about to graduate. She went off her meds. And that's another thing they kept doing, going off the meds. You know. And I was like, why are they doing that? They know they're going to go crazy if they go off the meds. It's happened tens of times before they got to the hospital. They know they're going to go nuts. Why are they doing that? So I started asking them, why are you going off your meds? And they would say, "Oh, the side effects are awful." Well, given the side effects are awful, so no contest there. But I went, what is worst? Being psychotic with hearing voices telling you to kill yourself, that people are going to kill you, calling you names, keeping you awake all night, tormenting you constantly 24 hours a day, bashing you, you know, making you paranoid, giving you nightmares. I mean, it's an absolute hell. You know? So I started doing a little research thing on it, um, and I'd call them in once they went off their meds, and I'd say, "Tell me all the bad side effects you had from your medications," because they all had different side effects. They didn't all have this, all the side effects or the same ones. So I'd write down all those side effects, separate sheet of paper. And then I'd give them a check sheet that came from the DSM with all the symptoms of, paranoid schizophrenia on there. Like a page and a half of these nasty symptoms that paranoid schizophrenia entailed. I gave them that and I said, check all the ones that you experience when you go psychotic, when the voices come back. Check all the ones that you experience. And they would, and there'd be a lot of them. And then I'd give them both sheets back and I said, which is worse? 100% of them said being psychotic is worst. And then I'd ask them, well, then why do you keep going off your medications? And they go, well, I don't know. I must have asked that for 3 solid years. Never got an answer. I don't know. That was the answer. I felt like a crazy guy asking the same question over and over and over and getting the same answer over and over and looking for a different answer. So the 7th year, I had this one girl in the cosmetology class. She was making good grades. She was about ready to graduate. She was doing fine. And she went off her meds a third time. So I called her in and said, we're going to have to discharge you. You're not going to stay on your meds. So that's the rule. So she told her mother, and her mother called me, and she was just virtually begging me. She said, "Don't do it. I can't handle her here. I just can't deal with her. I'll come up there, and we'll find out why she went off her meds." And she had to drive like 3 hours to get to the hospital. So I said, "Okay, all right. I'll meet with you Friday afternoon." She come in Friday afternoon. We called the girl in, and both of us, the mother and her, and myself, are saying, "Why did you go off the meds?" You know, she said, "Oh, well, it was the nasty side effects." I said, "Well, what's worse? You're about to lose your career. You're about to get thrown out of the hospital. You've experienced these things a number of times. You know, what's worse? What's about to happen to you, or staying on the meds?" She goes, "Well, what's about to happen to me is worse." And I said, "Well, why did you go off your medications a third time when you knew what was going to happen to you?" And her mother's begging her, "Tell us, please tell us." And she goes, you won't believe me. I said, "Well, try me. I've heard a lot of weird things since I've been working here. I don't think you're going to freak me out with anything." Um, so she said, "Okay." Yeah, the voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me. And they pointed to all the nasty side effects of these drugs, saying that this is the effect of you being poisoned. The psychiatrist is poisoning you. Look at all these nasty side effects. And it was true. So right away something clicked in my mind. I went, that's why they're getting their butts kicked. Because I've heard that from other patients earlier, that the psychiatrist is poisoning me. So that explained why there's such a high assault rate, mostly by schizophrenics against psychiatrists, because the voices are telling them that the psychiatrist is poisoning. And the psychiatrist has no knowledge of the voices, thinking they're hallucinations, that there's no uh, rhyme or reason behind them. That's one thing I noticed at the state hospital too. When I come out of graduate school, I was thinking that because they're calling them hallucinations, I was thinking, well, they're like word salad. They're like mumbo jumbo words that don't make sense, incoherent sentences and that. That's not what I saw. What I saw is the patients were talking and arguing with these voices like you're watching somebody talking over a telephone where you can hear what they say, but you can't hear what's coming back in. So I watched that over and over again with patients actually carrying on, vociferous arguments with their voices, screaming at them, yelling at them, uh, and then when I would show up, they'd shut up, or when any other staff came, they would shut up. Um, so it was clear that they were talking to somebody or something. But back then, I was having a hard time, with psychiatry looking over my shoulder, asking them, well, what are these voices saying to you? I found out that they were very negative, but I wasn't able to spend a lot of time with schizophrenics without having to worry about psychiatry, you know, gigging me for looking into this. Um, so that made a lot of sense. Um, I remember another kind of lie. I got this one all the way back to college. I remember when I was studying abnormal psychology. Um, they gave us an assignment. It was a paper written by a clinical psychologist who said that if two psychotic patients with the same delusion, so if they both thought they were Justin Trudeau, one of them would have to change that delusion to something else. And I'm going, why would that have to happen? I mean, they're both crazy. Why? 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 It made no sense to me, even as an undergraduate. And I tucked that in my memory, and I went, that's odd. So I felt something, what I hated about psychology, absolutely hated about it, is I didn't trust authority at all. And here they are filling our heads full of this stuff. And there was no way to check out whether it's true or not. The only class that I had that you could actually check out the truth of what they were teaching us was experimental psychology, where you can go into the rat lab, you can run these patterns, and you could watch the animals start developing those patterns. I mean, you could see it before your eyes. But everything else, you're taking the word for all these bozos out there. I didn't know at that time that 80% of what psychology published was garbage. There was a research organization that ran follow-up research on hundreds of things that psychologists published. 80% of it was not replicable. And I saw that when I got to graduate school. It was publish or perish. They had to publish. And when I got into the PhD program, here was this immense pressure to publish and to publish anything. It didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter if it had any significance. Just publish it, you know. And I remember one research thing I was working on depression, and uh, my advisor said, "Well, you just publish this little bit. It doesn't matter. You know, just add it to the same stuff that all these other people are publishing." I said, "Well, I don't want to do that. You know, that's a waste of time." He goes, "Well, just publish it and put it out there." You know, they were publishing garbage. They were publishing anything, just to get the university notice. So, you know, it was a saying, "Publish or perish." They had so they're publishing garbage, and 80% in that with psychology. So the first time I became aware of that was with this clinical psychologist, where the two nuts have the one had the change, and one of the first couple of years I was working on the psych unit, I was following around a patient who was arguing with his voices, trying to get close enough to hear what he was saying, and he caught me. So he's looking at me, he shuts up, and I said, "Well, I'm Jerry. I'm the psych for this unit. I don't recognize you. Are you new here?" He goes, "Yeah, I just got here a few days ago." I said, "Well, what's your name?" And he says, "I'm Jesus Christ." And I looked at him, and I thought for a second, and I looked him in the eye and I said, "No, no, no, you can't be Jesus Christ because I am." And I sat there waiting. What's he going to do? Is he going to change his delusion, or is he going to, what's he going to do? So he stood there and he's thinking about this. And I see his eyes roll up, and then he makes a decision. He looks at me and he goes, "We can both be Jesus Christ." And he strolls off. And I went, what else did they lie to me about? Yeah. So it was at that point where I was like, okay, how much of what did they teach me were lies
Mm, mm,
that I couldn't prove? And
right.
the way I was raised, I had a very strong distrust of authority anyway. But having to memorize all this crap and spit it back at them for 4 years in undergraduate psychology, without having any way to check it out for myself, made me very uncomfortable.
And when you just got disabused of the suspect theories regarding schizophrenia from the psychiatric mafia, as you call it, and witnessing things like you just articulated, like the coherent patterns, the anti-religiosity, the energy depletion. What was the thing that kind of like pivoted you from seeing these voices as parasitic entities? Did something like the patients told you directly, or is it like you're reading something, or is it like a
No,
conflict?
no, no, they told me directly. I mean, I interviewed literally hundreds of them, but see, I didn't want to believe that these things were separate entities. And it was like there was always some doubt, despite the fact that the inmates were, or the patients and the inmates were telling me that they were. You know, even when I got into the prison, that's where I could really do some research, because if a psychiatric patient went up to the warden and said, "Hey, the psych is asking me all these questions about my voices and I don't like it. It's upsetting the voices." The warden would go, "Get out of my face. Go play in the traffic. Get out of here." That wouldn't even approach the level at which there would be a reaction. So what I did is I had a select group of inmates who were all schizophrenics, who were all paranoid schizophrenics. They were all hearing voices, and I would see them on a regular basis, and I had a deal with them. I'll help you out to the best of my ability if you will tell me what the voices are saying in real time while we're working together. Okay. So I had access to the voices. They would tell me what the voices were saying uh, to what I was saying, and uh, you know, and then I would kind of be able to communicate some with the voices, but they didn't want to talk to me directly a lot of the time. So what I saw is pattern after pattern after pattern was emerging, and I still didn't want to believe that these things were demons, or I mean, there was something in me that it had reservations. It was like I just didn't want to believe it, but the evidence kept piling up and piling up and piling up, and my denial system started crumbling. So I started wondering what would happen if I started throwing monkey wrenches into these patterns that these voices were running. Yeah. How would they react to it? So what I would do is I'd give each of these inmates I was working with a homework assignment to throw monkey wrenches into these patterns that the voices were running and come back the next week and tell me what happened. So I was always looking forward to like, what happened? What happened? To me, it was fascinating. It was like, okay, how'd they react to this? How'd they react to that? What are they doing with this? So after a while, these inmates started coming back one after another saying, the voices don't like you. They don't like what you're doing. They don't want us coming here. Every time we get up to come to the meetings, they're screaming. They don't want us coming to your office. They don't like what you're doing. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Um, so I kept it up. I'm finding more and more patterns and more different ways to interfere with those patterns. Okay. Uh, and then I remember one fellow I was working with as he was leaving the office that day. He turns around the office and he turns around and he looks at me and he goes, "You know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And then he just turns around and walks away. And I'm like, "What? What?" I had never thought about it. It never crossed my mind. But that was like, wonder what that was all about. You know, it was one of those things I put in the back of my mind. I didn't forget it, but I didn't pay a lot of attention to it either. I'm thinking, well, the voices are stuck in their heads. They're not in my head. They can't get out of there. You know, uh, they can't they can't do anything in physical reality. So I'm not worried about it. Little did I know. You know. So that was another warning that I got from them. And then let me see, what was the next one? Uh, the next one was one of the inmates I was working with. Um, got into the medical unit somehow without a pass. He knocks on my door, and he said, "The voices want to talk to you." And I'm like, "What?" I said, "They want to talk to me directly?" That had never happened before in 20 years of research prior to that. That had never happened. It was always the voices would talk to the patient would tell me what they said. I'd tell the patient, tell the voices, go stick your head in the toilet or something, and it would be that. Or it would always go through the patient. They never spoke to me directly. So I asked him, I said, "They want to talk to me directly?" And he goes, "Yeah, they want to talk to you directly." So I said, I was kind of weirded out. And I said, "Okay, come on in, have a seat," closed the door. And I said, "What do they have to say?" And these words came out of his mouth: "You have no right to interfere with our way of life, our way of life." And my head just went boom. And I'm looking at the prisoner, and he said, "That didn't come from me. Those weren't my words. I didn't say that. They said that." And I said, "Well, tell them this." And he said, "I don't have to tell them anything. They can see you, they can hear you." And that was something that weirded me out too. So my head just went boom. It was like my denial system at that point completely collapsed. At that point, I knew they were entities. They weren't hallucinations. They were uh, they operated with a negative, evil intent. They were parasites, and it was everything I feared that they might have been. And my denial system just caved in. Yeah. So I closed my office. I didn't see anybody for the rest of the day. It took me a couple of days to kind of settle out from that, but I didn't stop. So that was like a warning shot fired across my bow. But I didn't stop. And one day I was reading a book by Miguel Ruiz. I think it was The Voice of Knowledge. And he was talking about these things being energetic parasites. And I went, that's interesting. So I said, I'm going to bring this in and I'm going to ask one of my patients what he thinks about it. So drug it in, brought the book into the prison. I had an appointment with him, closed the door. I said, and I was always asking these guys questions. I was always bombarding them with questions. What did they do? What do the voices do now? What are they saying now? How are they behaving now? Are they getting stronger, weaker? What's going on? Uh, so I said, I have a paragraph I want to read you, and I'd like your opinion on it. So I started reading that paragraph, and I got to the part where Miguel was talking about these entities being parasitic, that they were energy vampires. And uh, I went to ask the patient, well, what do you think of that? And I look at him, and he's sitting there stark still with his eyes glazed over, just staring at me, you know, and it was weird. It was like, oh, what's going on with him? He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just had this zombie-like glaze. He was staring at me, and I'm like, he's going to attack. So I pushed my chair against the back wall in case he did, because all they had in the medical unit were female guards all the time. They would have been useless in an attack. So pushed my chair against the wall, and I'm waiting for him to jump up at me, and I would be able to kick him back. And I asked, I'm staring at him, and all of a sudden this electrical crackling erupts from behind my head. It sounded just like an arc welder. It was like crack, 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 rare, very loud. And then it started moving up the wall to my left of my office. And I'm looking, I don't see anything. I don't smell anything. I look at him, and he's still staring back at me like a zombie. And I said, do you hear that? And he doesn't say anything. He's just got this zombie stare, and he's just looking at me. And I was afraid to keep my attention off him for too long because I didn't know what he was going to do. He was looking very strange, and I kept back and forth, like kind of looking for what's causing this noise, and then looking at him to make sure he's not moving. And it crackled all the way up the right hand side of my office at a 45-degree angle up to the ceiling. And then it starts crossing the ceiling right where the joint came together, and I could see him, and I could see where the sound was coming from at the same time, but I still didn't see anything. I didn't smell anything. I could only hear it, and it was moving, and it wasn't like a brief, 10 seconds or something like that. This went on for 20, 25 seconds. It was crack, 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 crack. And I'm like totally freaked out. I'm like, what the hell is happening? And then it starts moving down the left hand wall near where my leg is, crackling all the way down the wall. I could see him the entire time. And then it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can near my left leg. And I look down in there, there's nothing in there. The inmate porter had cleaned it the night before. It was just an empty plastic bag. And here's whatever this crackling down there. And I'm looking, and I don't see anything. And then boom, as fast as it came, it shut up. It went dead. And I'm like shocked, totally shocked. And he starts to move, and my attention's right on him. And he slowly gets up, and he goes, I gotta leave. And he shuffles out of the office, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, get the hell out of here, go, go, you know. And he disappears down the hall, and I'm just absolutely, my mind is blown. It's like, am I going psychotic? Am I getting crazy? And there's nobody I could talk to. The only people who understood anything near what I was learning were the schizophrenics themselves. I couldn't talk to any staff. I couldn't even talk to my wife because she's going, "Hey, what are you doing picking through the heads of psychotic, criminally insane anyway? You shouldn't be doing that." So there was nobody I could talk to until I met Sherry Sweeney, the co-author of our book. Who she had a psychotic break when she was a young woman. Um, but for years, there was nobody I could talk to, and I was thinking, I'm losing it. I'm going crazy too. Whatever it is infesting me. It's affecting me. Um, so it was probably 3 or 4 months before I got the courage to bring this guy back into the office. So I put out a pass for him to come to the psychology office, comes in that morning and he looks good. I thought he would be a wreck. And I said, boy, you look good. And he goes, yeah, yeah. And he says, I'm doing what you taught me to do. I haven't got rid of the voices, but it's a Mexican standoff. They haven't gotten any worse either. And I'm going, okay, so they're still there. And he's coming back in my office again, but he looked normal. He was acting normal. He didn't have that glaze kind of thing. And I asked him, you remember the last time you were in my office? I said, did you hear that crackling? He goes, yeah, I heard it. And he says, I was surprised you heard it, meaning me. And I said, what in the blazes was that? And he said, that was them. And I said, them who? And I said, was that the voices? And he goes, yeah, that were the voices. And I said, well, what in the hell were they doing? He said, they were trying to scare you off. I said, well, they did a damn good job of it. And I said, you looked really strange when you left my office. I mean, you looked like a zombie. I said, what were the voices telling you at that time? He said, they were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your gut. And I'm going, he wouldn't do that. I worked with this guy for 6 months. I know him well. He wouldn't do that. And I asked him, well, why didn't you do it? And he said, I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one. So it was like, these things are dangerous. So there was no doubt in my mind that what psychiatry is telling the human race on this planet, that these voices are hallucinations, is bullcrap. It's absolute bullcrap.
Mm-hmm.
They're running patterns. They're affecting behavior. They're talking to schizophrenics and telling them to do things that are destructive to themselves and others. They're malicious. They're parasitic. And it's not just schizophrenics who hear them. We all hear them. They come as intrusive thoughts. They pop into your mind and they say, "Oh, that was stupid," or "Why did you say that?" Or "What does this guy think of you now after you said that?" Or they tell you to do something that you just normally wouldn't do. I had one guy write me. He goes, "Yeah, you're right. I had this intrusive voice come into my head when I was walking behind my boss, telling me loudly to spit on him." You know, uh, so they hit us all. I mean, this is what you can call the archons. Um, so it begs to the investigation, where do thoughts come from? That's something that psychology and psychiatry never ask. And it's the crux of everything. Where do thoughts come from? You know, how did they get there? The Christian mystic Emanuel Swedenborg said, none of your thoughts are yours. They either come in from heaven or they come in from hell. You're the chooser. You're the one who decides which ones you're going to put attention on. And the ones you pay attention on to are the ones that you track more of. They get stronger and you start moving in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
So if you start putting your thoughts on, uh, you know, positive spiritual stuff, you start moving in that direction. But your mind is like a radio receiver. It receives those thoughts, but you're the one who decides which ones you're going to entertain and which ones you're going to throw out.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so if you have any questions, anyone in the room right now,
Oh yeah, feel free to ask questions.
I have two more. So after these experiences, and the last one was pretty intense that we shared with the crackling, and your imagine your explorations and your readings since then, what is your current sort of take or theory on what these things are, these entities / demons are?
Well, they're negative energy. They're energetic beings. They work in a different dimension. There is no time, space, or matter where they're at. So they can follow a schizophrenic to the ends of the earth. You can go from here to Germany or Antarctica, and the voices will be there because there is no time or space for them. So you can't get rid of them by physically moving somewhere else. They'll just follow you. So what they are, they're energetic parasites. They feed on us all, not just schizophrenics. It's most noteworthy with the schizophrenics. That's where it's most obvious. But they hit us all. You're walking down the street and all of a sudden you have this negative intrusive thought, why don't you do this? Or you're driving in traffic and you go, you just ram that son of a bitch. Or, the stuff that you would never act on But to even think about it is shocking. There was one day. This is a classic example. Here in Arizona, that there's not enough water for most people to grow lawns, so we have cactus and trees and different kind of stuff. But uh, you kind of mow the lawn with a machete and cut down the cactus to keep it under control. So I have a beautiful, pure white, uh, kind of Alaskan husky who's part wolf, gorgeous dog. She was out there with me while I was, chopping down cactus. And she runs by and hears this voice that just booms into my head very loudly. Chop her head off. It's like just having that thought was upsetting. I knew it wasn't mine. I knew I would never act on anything like that. But just the fact that that thought entered my mind was upsetting. And I still remember it to this day. Yeah. So they're doing that to all of us. And you look what's going on the planet right now. They love the suffering. This war in Ukraine, this insanity that's going on in Ukraine. They lost that war, and here's NATO, which is supposed to be a defensive alliance, shipping all these weapons and generals over there who are getting blown up in these bunkers by the Russians, taking an offensive stance. 600,000 Ukrainians are dead now because of this insanity. They can't win that war, and they're still pushing it. They're still sending weapons over there. They're still sending monies over there, and the immense amount of suffering, not only by uh, the population there, but by the soldiers. These things are having a hog fest over there.
And so the last question I have, then we'll pivot to the Q&A. As people at the Stoa know, I what started the series is sort of me investigating my personal experiences that I had, which was quite intense, demonic like. And the first one I had, it was back in, I can't remember now, it was like 2013 or something. There was a lot of intrusive thoughts that happened. This is when I was more of a skeptical and then didn't have that kind of treating these things as if they're like ontologically real. And this book kind of helped the input of the mind. It's just a psychological book. They don't talk about entities. They just talk about techniques on how to deal with intrusive thoughts. And it was helpful. But then they came back. And since then, various techniques have helped. And I'm curious, like I know that there's That's a Lie protocol that you recommend and the Mace energy method. Maybe you can elaborate on like the practice space in order to effectively address these intrusive thoughts and these voices.
Well, I was reading a article that an expert supposedly wrote on these things um, just the other day, and he said, "Well, um, you know, just realize that they're lies." So it's basically is the That's a Lie program. So Sherry Sweeney in our our book here that we wrote on the called The Amazing Journey Through the Psychotic Mind. She was hearing voices when she was younger, and she beat them back with the fact that 98% of what they tell people are lies. It's just to upset them. Okay. They want you upset. They want you paranoid. They want you feeling guilty. They want you feeling uh, whatever negative. That's what they feed off of, the negative emotion. So once Sherry realized that these things were liars, she would just say, "That's a lie." She'd evaluate it. She'd go, "That's a lie," and she'd dismiss it. Because if you resist them or try to ignore them, they get louder. So now they're using your energy again because you're resisting them. And what you resist persists. But That's a Lie program works because it's like, okay, you acknowledge what they said, you acknowledge it's a lie, and you dismiss it. Okay, so there's no resistance there. So realizing that you know your thoughts are not yours. They come in from other places, and the 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 negative ones they can speak in our language. You know, they can put you down. You're stupid. You're ugly. Why did you do that thing? Get you remunerate over and over again about something you did. You don't see that in the animal kingdom. It doesn't happen. You watch a lion grab onto a gazelle or something, and it gets away, and it runs, and once it's safe, it looks around and it's safe, and then it just goes on with its life. It doesn't keep remunerating about something it did over and over and over again. Um, these things want that. So when anything goes wrong, they want to pour gasoline on it and just make it worse. Yeah. So they'll take whatever situation you get into that's a bad situation, and they will just make it worse. They would just keep it up. Now the positive spirits, they speak more in feelings and intuition and serendipity. So you get a strong feeling, well, you shouldn't do that, or an intuition, you shouldn't do that. Um, or maybe a car drives in front of you with a license plate that answers some question that you had in your mind, or things work out the way they're supposed to because you did something that you were supposed to. I've not seen the positive ones speak out loud unless the people were on the verge of death. And I watched in the emergency room, these people would come in after having made serious suicide attempts. And I was needing to evaluate them as to whether they should be psychiatrically hospitalized or whether we could release them or not. And that's where the, you know, watching the positive ones come into play appeared over and over and over again. And these people should have been dead by all rights. I mean, they should not have survived. They just should not have survived. I remember one lady, her everything was going wrong in her life. She got a divorce. Her kid was giving her trouble. She was fired. She was out of money. She was depressed. Everything was going wrong. So she goes, I'm done with it. I'm gonna kill myself. But she couldn't bring herself to take poison or cut her wrist. So she decided she was going to go out to the train tracks in a small town south of here. She was drugged and drunk, and she was waiting for the train to come by. So the train was coming. She was talking to her sister in San Diego, telling her, goodbye. And as the train got closer, she drove around the barrier and stopped the car right in front of the train, and boom, it smacked her. It threw the car over onto another train track, and another train came and hit her again. So she was hit by two trains. The second one threw her like 50 yards off the road. The car was so crumpled that she couldn't get out of it. They had to cut her out of it. And when they did, it was like 2 hours later. Here she is sitting in front of me in the emergency room after being hit by two trains, having to be cut out of the car. And all she had was a black eye. And I'm like, what? You know, you got hit by two trains and all you have is a black eye. And she goes, yeah. And I said, what were you thinking when you came to in the wreckage? And she goes, I was furious. I wanted to be dead. I did not want to be here. And she was very angry. And then she said, I heard a voice said, can't come and just say, calm down. Everything's going to be okay. And then she just felt this feeling go through her, like a knowing that everything was going to be okay. Yeah. And after talking to her, I went, well, she's not suicidal anymore. I don't feel she's a threat to herself. And I wrote a recommendation that she be released on her own recognizance. I never thought psychiatry would allow it, and never thought they would go. That they let her out. Another guy had a 357 Magnum, all cylinders full. Puts it to his head, click. Puts it to the ground, bang. Puts it to his head, click. Puts it to the ground, bang. And he goes, okay, I got it. It was incident after incident after scores of them. I should have wrote them down, but they were so common. It was just like they were like lobsters used to be. They used to use them for dog food. You know. So all I have is a handful, but believe me, there were dozens and dozens of them where something jumped in there where these people should have been dead by all rights. Another one I remember, a guy put a 45 to his head, pulled the trigger, and the bullet didn't fire. He took it out to the range the next day, put that same bullet in there, and it fired. So incident after incident like that. So there is a positive side there. It's just not as loud or as demanding or as uh, negative as it's not negative at all. It's more subtle.
All right. And I'll include some of that, these links on the description. But let's pivot to Q&A. And do you have any hard stop, Jerry?
No.
You good for another 30 minutes or so?
Yeah, I'm fine.
All right. I might read some of the
I saw some questions on there that I could answer
yeah.
if you remember what they were.
Walker, You can check if your mic's working. If not, I'll read your question on your behalf. Oop, no, your mic's not working. Okay. I'll read your first question. Uh, do you now hold an alternative exploration for other neurotic ailments like bipolar, borderline, OCD, anxiety as being extensions of these negative energies or entities? If so, how does that change your view of the established treatments for these issues?
Well, what I ran into maybe 3 years ago was a new energetic therapy that is emerging, and it's being suppressed by the mainstream, but it's very different from any traditional therapy. Okay, totally energetic. The therapist does not have to know what the trauma was that caused the problems, which is fascinating because all other therapies, they beat to death whatever it was. Oh, what happened to you? And then da 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 da, and then you go through it over and over and over again, and nothing changes. They leave the therapist office feeling good for a few hours, and then it all comes back again. So, who invented this therapy was not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a scientist. It was a fellow named John Mace, who was a master mariner and a ship captain. You know, He he was a brilliant guy. He was widely read. As a ship captain, he had to know about magnetism. He had to know about electricity. He had to know how they worked, how the magnetic fields. Um, he had to know, all the workings of how energy flowed. Uh, and he was putting that. He was looking for a cure for psychological illnesses. So he found something called a negative identity that was created during a trauma. Okay. So what happens during a trauma is that all your attention is put on you and you make a decision about who you are in the face of that trauma. Who are you as a result of that trauma? And it's virtually always uh, a negative decision about you and who you were, okay, or who you are. And uh, what happens in that trauma is there's an awful feeling, and it just doesn't go away. So the ego shows up and goes, hey, let me handle this. And it takes it and it buries it in the subconscious mind. And not only buries it, it buries it alive and then it locks it down. So it's trapped there. And it works like a computer virus, only it's a mind virus. So whoever traumatized you and caused that negative identity, that negative feeling that's buried, anytime somebody like that shows up in your psychological sphere, there's a strong reaction from this buried garbage in there. But since it's trapped there, it projects out from there and says, it's that person out there who's causing you to feel bad. It doesn't want you to find out that it's something in you that's reacting to something out there, and it tells you attack that person or run from that person or avoid that person. But it's that person's fault. It's got nothing to do with you. So what Mace found was this negative identity is what's driving that. So that negative identity affects your thoughts, it affects your feelings, it affects your decisions, it affects what you say and don't say. It's like a computer virus running in the back of your mind telling you that you are whatever you decided during that trauma. Okay. So there was a decision made and it's buried now. So because of that trauma, you might have decided, well, I'm stupid or I'm no good or I'm worthless. All that's buried with it. So anytime somebody triggers that, this thing starts reacting and it causes an upset. Now, the problem Mace had was, where did the ego bury that stuff? Because it could be anywhere in the subconscious mind. You know, so that's where he turned to his spiritual part and his scientific training, that energy flows from negative to positive. Right? It flows from negative to positive in batteries. It flows from negative to positive in all electrical fields. And there's an electrical field around the wire. So he knew that the spirit in individuals was positive energy. It's a God energy. It's your soul. It's positive. these negative identities are negative. So if he could find where they were located and hook the two together, it's like if you hook a negative pole to a positive pole, the negative pole will disappear, the positive pole will absorb it. So the body has its polarities also. The spirit is positive. These negative identities are masses of negative energy. Okay, they are the cause of bipolar. They are the cause of um, virtually every negative thing that happens to you. Okay, um, they're the cause of personality disorders. They're the cause of drinking. They're the cause of smoking. Uh, they're they consist of most common psychological problems. So what Mace found was that if you can turn that negative identity into an image, that image was the location of that negative identity. And then there was a way to connect that negative identity with the spirit, and the spirit would absorb it, and it would absorb it within an hour. And what's so sad is some of these older people I work with. This is called the Mace Energy Method. Something happened to them when they were 7 years old that made them determine that they were wicked and they were evil and they were no good. It happened when they were 7 years old. They went through their entire life believing that. They call that the rune. It destroyed their entire life. We get rid of it within an hour with the system. It's gone. They feel lighter. It no longer bothers them. There's no longer a reaction. And they spent their whole life feeling like they were worthless and stupid because of this negative identity that we got rid of in an hour. It's just such a shame. And what the Mace people, this came from Australia. So Mace was a Australian ship captain, master mariner, brilliant guy, you know, very brilliant. It was interesting what they said dealing with him. He was like a ship captain. He would give commands, they would be very succinct and very abrupt. And it was different from how most people interact. It's like, do this, do that. It was like, and everybody would like, well, he's kind of abrupt. Well, what do you want? He's a ship captain. He's used to giving orders. You know, so he figured that out. Once they got it tuned down, they started teaching it. They took it to the university in Australia. They demonstrated how well it worked and said, you should be using this in your mental health centers. You should be using this in your student counseling centers. You should be teaching this instead of, this drivel that you're teaching. And they went, we'll consider it if you give us the copyright. The organization went, well, screw you. We're not going to give you the copyright. It took Mace a lifetime. It was John Mace and another John. They worked as a team, um, and then they took it up to the Australian legislature. They demonstrated how well it worked, okay, to the legislature, and the legislature completely ignored it. So this system is a threat to traditional psychology and psychiatry. They don't want to see it out there. So I'm a certified MACE therapist. You can go to my website. There's a place to sign up for MACE sessions there. Um, there may be 50 of us on the planet right now. It's growing. As people see how well it works, there's more people signing up for certification. So a lot of these what they call psychological illnesses, are negative identities. Okay? And where I'm at right now is sometimes I can't tell the difference between a negative identity and the voices. Sometimes I think it's the voices. We run, you know, uh, the MACE procedure, and that voice disappears. So it wasn't a voice; it was a negative identity. Now, MACE works anyway, even if you're hearing voices, because what it does is it gets rid of the traumas that these things feed off of. Because these voices can enter your mind because they're energetic. They can pull up every rotten thing you've ever done, throw it in your face, and just keep hammering on it and hammering at it and hammering at it until you start feeling bad. And then they suck that energy off. So once you get rid of those traumas, their food source is greatly restricted.
Um,
So I hope that ends. Most psychological problems can be handled by the Mace energy method.
Very interesting. Wendy, you had a question on trauma. Do you have any questions or shares that you'd like to tag onto that?
Hi. I think you've answered the question I was going to ask, how it is trauma, and I've just made a comment about the connections we form and we lock in the images or the energy or what have you. Yeah, and then it affects us. Yeah.
Yeah, it's frozen in there, and it stays there unless it's removed.
Yeah, indeed.
Thanks, Wendy. Apostle, you had a question.
Yes. So thanks for your explanation. It was very interesting to hear. As my meditation journey was progressing, I was kind of learning how to move between the shamanic and kind of materialist worldviews. And in the shamanic worldview, there is generally the notion that if you get attacked by negative entities, you can invite on or invoke resources or positive ones to help you like protect yourself. I was wondering if you actually like invited some of your patients to do something like that. For example, like the very basic advice that you get from people on podcasts is if you feel like you've been attacked, start doing a mantra, right? For like there are a few famous mantras. And yeah, I was wondering, have you ever tried that with your patients? Or
Well, I haven't tried mantras. So what I'm a little, what that does, it blocks them out. So when you're blocking them out, you're expending energy to block them out with the mantra. Okay? What you resist persists. So these things will not be, they will not be pushed out. They just get stronger. So when I got a lot of patients go, oh, well, I just ignore them. Well, how's that working for you? Well, not real well. They, I ignore them, but they're still there. They're still pushing. They still come back. The other thing that kind of concerns me, if you empty your mind, that just gives them, okay, there's no resistance whatsoever there. So what I found, like in the early days, the 23rd Psalm, I've had patients tell me that uh, when they repeat the 23rd Psalm, it's like burning them with a blowtorch. They can't stand it. Okay. Um, there's a number of other things.
yeah, for example, maybe in inviting Archangel Michael
Yep.
or
Yep.
like something like that, right?
Right. Yes. To pray.
Yeah.
To invite or ask Archangel Michael for help. These things hate the Gregorian chants, especially the French ones. So play the Gregorian chants. They hate iron. I don't know why they don't like iron. They just don't like iron. So if you've seen these graveyards with these iron fences around from the early 1800s or something, that's to keep the demons out. Um, they hate church. They hate the Bible. Uh, they want they want to break up all your relationships. They want to destroy your friendships. They want to destroy the family. A lot of schizophrenics will make the family so miserable that the family will go lock yourself in the bedroom and go do whatever you do there. That's the worst thing you could do for them. Anything negative feeds them. Negative movies, murder mysteries, you know, war stories, anything negative feeds them. And you look what the freaking television is putting out right now. How many times? By the time a kid gets to teenage years, they've committed. That they've watched thousands and thousands of murders on television with guns. So what these bastards are teaching on television is that's how you solve your problems. You go get a gun and shoot somebody. You know. So and then these violent video games, they should be outlawed also. Those are also demonic, where they're killing people and shooting people, and those should be totally illegal. So yeah, there's ways to fight them, if you set,
But in your practice, you haven't had the opportunity to actually invite one of the patients to do something like that, like invite an archangel or do something. And would
well,
something like, I was just wondering, what something like that would have an effect? Because in a sense, their mind is already open to the negative entities. It might be open to the positive ones as well.
well, the negative
I
ones
think.
don't want any help from any positive. They treat anybody who's giving these people help as an enemy.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
so family is an enemy. Anybody who tries to help them is an enemy. The psychiatrist is an enemy. And a lot of times, the voices will tell them to attack these people who are trying to help them the most. You know, they don't want them to have any family. They don't want them to have any friends. What they want is to them to be locked in a room, you know, or sent to prison where these voices have complete control of them, their attention all the time. And what they do is they slowly push the personality out of the way as they take the person over. You know? And I have a poem written by a schizophrenic who he murdered 3 people, and he got his girlfriend and he cut her into thousands of little pieces. I can read that at some point today. I have it here somewhere, if you want me to.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe that sounds a little dark.
It's pretty creepy.
Oh,
But he's talking about his voices in that poem.
mm, mm. Thanks, Professor, for the question. We have a few more. Yeah, okay. So here's a question someone asked earlier. Gregory Bateson, who folks know what the Stoa is, Nora Bateson's dad, came out with the double bind theory in 1956. The theory goes that when children are given conflicting messages at the same time, they're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't type situations, the kid's mental health is impacted. So a client of mine with a schizophrenic brother confirmed that her mother would consistently devise contradictory and painful mental landscapes. So in their case, if these parasites are real, are they impacting both the mother and the son?
Yeah, they will impact the entire family. Okay, and they, you know, you go. Lots of times there's 50,000 suicides in the U.S. every year. A great number of those people are on antipsychotic or antidepressant drugs. That's as many that died in Vietnam in 10 years, and it's happening year after year after year after year. And what is telling them to kill themselves? These entities are. You have to have the thought before you do it. You know, oh, you're worthless. You're too much of a problem. You're causing problems with others. You're miserable. Why don't you just end it all and save everybody the trouble? That's the common thing that they tell these people. So these things are killing people every year. 50,000 people. That's year after year after year, and it's increasing. The prison population here in the United States, they've closed down the state hospitals where they were able to help these people at a much less cost than the prisons. So they close them down. Where these guys hit the streets, the only way they can survive is by stealing or selling drugs or doing something illegal. They can't hold a job. So then they lock them up in prison. So they spend 10, 15, 20 years in prison. They come out as hardened criminals, emotionally hardened, you know, with it's like graduate school for criminals, and they release them on the streets with $50. Say, okay, you're free. Okay? This is the Western mental health system here, and the state hospitals are no better. It's like drug them silly, keep them down. They're not curing anybody. None of those drugs are curing anybody. Uh, Antidepressant sales, $15.98 billion by 2023. That's 2023. It's probably 17 or 18 billion dollars now. Those drugs don't cure anything. Matter of fact, there's warnings, suicidal ideation warnings on a number of them, saying may cause suicidal ideation. Nothing is being cured. These buzzards are only in it for the money. They don't care about curing people. The FDA and Miami, the research branch for mental illness in the United States, has had a dribble of funding for looking for a cure of schizophrenia. So they were embarrassed by that. So what they did is they manipulated the statistics to make it look like they were spending more money looking for a cure than they actually were. So there's virtually no funding for schizophrenia research at all. And they're barking up the wrong tree anyway. They're still looking for a physical cause of schizophrenia, and it's not a physical illness. It's an energetic spiritual illness. So they're barking up the wrong tree. None of their drugs are going to get rid of anything. What they're doing is like, you get a magnet with a strong magnetic field. You can't see or smell or taste or touch, or that magnetic field for the human body is undetectable. You get a jar full of iron filings and you put that on the magnetic field. Now you can see the magnetic field. Well, these patterns that are on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com are the iron filings for schizophrenia. Anybody who has a schizophrenic or working with schizophrenics or around schizophrenics can look at these patterns and see them for themselves. It's not like the genetic stuff where, oh, well, only we have control of that, only we can see it, or the biochemical imbalance thing is where only biochemists can see it. No, it's right there in front of you. Anybody who looks can see it. It's there. And anything that's running patterns is not a hallucination, especially with the 23 patterns we've discovered. It's right there in front of their eyes. All they got to do is look.
Mm. And so we're going to gently close now. Thanks everyone for the questions. Maybe I'll sneak in one last question, because I found a lot of stuff here useful, like the kind of the heuristic if these negative malicious entities, they kind of speak to words in your head, while like the positive energies is more like the felt sense, and then the intuition and signs. That's cool. And then another one that I felt was helpful is like this isolation. They just want you to lock in a room, a jail cell, or just in your home. And that's kind of like, being extremely online too. It's like you're really by yourself, and then you're more susceptible. I know when I'm kind of like, on the internet too much, weird stuff starts feeling weird stuff, energy. Is there any other kind of like, you think like just super helpful practical tips, heuristics that you can leave us with?
Well, what people have to understand is that a great number of their thoughts don't come from them. Nobody's ever done an autopsy on the brain and found a thought. They're not there. What I do when I get a negative thought, I realize that you got to kind of watch what's coming into your mind. When I get a negative thought, what I do is I imagine that I put the thought in a box with one of those flash grenades like the police use to stun people. And I take it and I throw it back into hell to the demons that put it in there in the first place. And I imagine that it goes off in their face. So one thing I saw that's really interesting is when I was experimenting with in the ER. Okay, some of these people would come in with voices that were so strong and persistent that I couldn't get any information out of them as to clinically what was going on with them. Or I knew the voices were strong. I knew they were pretty far out there, but I couldn't do the mental status exam. So what I would imagine would be I'd ask the people, you hearing voices? And they go, yeah, they're screaming at me. So what I would vividly imagine duct tape being wrapped around the heads and the mouths of these voices. And then when I was done, I'd open my eyes and I'd say, have they shut up? And they would say, yeah, they shut up. I remember one who said, well, they're not talking, they're going, So what you vividly imagine happening to them over there actually happens to them, because you are a creator also. All right. Just like they are putting thoughts in your head and creating thoughts in your head, you're creating thoughts and throwing them back at them. So I would imagine them put locked in a box of light and thrown out into outer space somewhere, and they'd stay away for 15, 20 minutes before they somehow found their way back. So whatever you vividly imagine happening to them actually happens to them on that other side.
Wow. It's a very trippy thought, and a nice one to leave us with. So yeah, Jerry, thanks so much for coming out today to the Stoa and having the courage to kind of go against everything that basically you learned and you're
Yeah,
working with.
I
So
want
it's
my money back. All that money I spent on education, I want it back. I want a refund. It was virtually worthless.
yeah, sometimes we gotta find out something's worthless in order to find what's worthy. So appreciate you going through this journey and sharing it with us today. And then next session in the series is on sleep paralysis, entities, demons, and that's next Wednesday. So you can check that out here at the Stoa. So Jerry, everyone, thanks so much for coming out today.
Okay. Thanks for having me.